Senator Camila Hayes had always found comfort in routine. After a long week of meetings, public addresses, and drafting policies, her Saturday afternoon ritual was one of life's simple pleasures. Visiting her mother. It grounded her, gave her a sense of peace, and reminded her of her roots. Now, with a warm smile still lingering from their goodbye, she made her way through the quiet parking lot of the suburban mall, her heels clicking against the pavement as she approached her car, a bag of groceries in hand. The lot was mostly empty, a quiet oasis compared to the rush inside. She barely noticed the police cruiser slowly pulling in behind her, its engine humming low as it moved across the lot like a prowling animal. Inside the cruiser, Officer Janice Salazar was winding down her shift. With years on the force, she had built a reputation as a by-the-book cop, strict but fair, at least in her own eyes. Scanning the lot, her gaze fell on Camila, who was now pausing by her car, appearing momentarily lost in thought as she checked her phone. Salazar's eyes narrowed. A lone figure, in an empty lot, looking into a car window with a large bag. It didn't sit right with her. What's she up to? Janice muttered under her breath, her suspicion hardening as she turned the wheel and brought the cruiser to a stop nearby. With a practiced air of authority, Janice stepped out of the car, hand resting on her belt, her fingers hovering just inches away from her baton. Her steps were swift, deliberate, the posture of someone used to being in control. Camila, focused on balancing her bag as she unlocked the door, hadn't noticed Janice's approach until the voice cut through the still air. "Excuse me, ma'am," Janice called out, her voice firm, carrying a hint of accusation. "May I ask what you're doing here?" Camila turned, her surprise quickly fading into calm as she assessed the uniformed figure approaching her with evident suspicion. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" Janice's eyes raked over Camila's well-tailored coat, the dignified way she held herself. Yet, her suspicion didn't waver. "I asked what you're doing here," she said, her tone sharper now. "ID, please." Camila's brows furrowed slightly, the request as jarring as it was unwarranted. She kept her voice steady, measured. "Officer, is there a reason you're asking? I haven't done anything wrong." Janice's jaw tightened, her patience thinning. She didn't have time for this. "Just show me your ID, ma'am. I'll decide if there's a reason or not." Camila took a deep breath, feeling her heartbeat quicken slightly. Years of public service had taught her to stay calm under pressure. But the weight of the officer's gaze, the presumption of guilt in her eyes, stirred something deep within her. Silently, she reached into her purse, pulling out her wallet and handing over her driver's license. Janice snatched it without a word, eyes darting over the name and address, oblivious to the significance of the title printed beneath. "Senator Camila Hayes," she read aloud, brows lifting as if seeing the title for the first time but not bothering to hide her disinterest. She looked back at Camila, unimpressed. "Never heard of you." Camila held her ground, her face as poised as ever. "I represent District 12, she said, her voice gentle but unwavering, as though explaining to a child. "I have every right to be here, officer, just as much as anyone else." Janice barely glanced at the ID before pocketing it like evidence, folding her arms across her chest. "Right? Well, I don't care who you are, senator or otherwise. Something about this doesn't feel right." The disbelief in Camila's eyes mirrored the silent indignation rising within her. "Officer, this is a public mall. I was simply shopping," she said, her voice laced with a cool authority that might have intimidated anyone else. But Janice was unmoved, her expression hardening further as she stepped into Camila's path. "You can explain that at the station," Janice declared, her voice final, as if Camila's word alone wasn't enough. The statement landed with the weight of a hammer, and for the first time, Camila's composure wavered. She opened her mouth to protest, her thoughts racing. "Officer, I'd like to speak to a lawyer," she said, struggling to keep her voice even. But Janice wasn't listening. She had already taken Camila by the arm, guiding her toward the cruiser with a grip that was firm, almost unyielding. Camila's heart pounded as she took slow, measured breaths, each one reminding her to stay calm, to keep control. She knew there was no basis for her arrest, that this would be resolved soon enough. Yet, as Janice closed the cruiser door, the humiliation of it, of being treated like a criminal in broad daylight, settled heavy in her chest. Onlookers watched in silence as the cruiser pulled away, confusion and curiosity sparking quiet conversations as they watched the well-dressed woman in the back seat disappear from view. For the first time in years, Camila felt the sting of powerlessness, but she held on to one thought, one certainty, that steadied her as the station loomed closer. The truth would set her free, and once it did, she wouldn't let this injustice be swept under the rug. Not this time. The journey to the station felt endless. Though it lasted barely 10 minutes, Camila sat in the back of the cruiser, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her mind racing through a storm of emotions. She had built her entire career on composure, on knowing when to speak and when to hold back. But here, confined and helpless, she felt her patience fraying with every passing second. Outside, the world rushed by, oblivious to the injustice unfolding behind tinted glass. Janice drove in silence, her eyes fixed on the road, her face set in a mask of rigid resolve. There was no trace of doubt in her, no flicker of realization about the gravity of what she had done. To her, Camila was just another person she had brought down to size, another reminder of her authority. The irony was bitter, almost laughable. The senator, the voice for the people, restrained in the back of a patrol car. As they pulled into the station, Janice finally broke the silence with a clipped, "We're here." She parked the cruiser and got out, opening the back door with a stiff efficiency that sent another wave of humiliation through Camila. "Out of the car, please," she ordered, her tone firm, unyielding. Camila emerged slowly, her head held high despite the glances thrown her way by officers and staff passing through the parking lot. She could feel their eyes on her, the surprise, the confusion. A few paused, whispers rippling as her identity began to sink in among those who recognized her. They stared, wondering what a state senator could have done to end up here, escorted like a criminal. Without a word, Janice led her inside, her hand hovering over Camila's arm as though she might bolt at any moment. The precinct was buzzing with activity, phones ringing, papers shuffling, voices murmuring over cases both trivial and dire. But as Camila passed, a hush seemed to follow her, one officer after another going silent as they registered her face. "Hey, isn't that," one whispered, nudging a fellow officer who, wide-eyed, took in the unexpected scene. "Senator Hayes?" The disbelief in their eyes only amplified Camila's quiet sense of defiance. Every step felt like a declaration. She would not let this officer strip her of her dignity. But beneath that steadfast exterior, a well of frustration churned. She knew her rights, knew this was a wrongful arrest, and she was determined to confront this head-on. Janice stopped before a small interrogation room, gesturing curtly, "In here." Camila stepped inside, taking in the cold, gray walls, the sterile metal table, the harsh fluorescent lights casting a shadow that felt like an insult. She sat down slowly, hands resting on the table, steady, unwavering. Janice shut the door behind her with a clang that echoed in the empty space, leaving Camila alone. Minutes ticked by, stretching like hours. The room was silent, the kind of silence that gnawed at a person's patience, designed to make even the strongest unravel. But Camila was not just anyone. She sat calmly, her gaze focused on the door, a quiet strength radiating from her. She had spent years in politics, negotiating heated debates, navigating challenges that would shake others. This room, this moment, it would not break her. At last, the door swung open, and a tall, middle-aged man with a kind but firm face stepped inside.
Lieutenant Jordan Pierce.
He closed the door gently behind him, regarding Camila with a mixture of respect and concern. He extended a hand. "Senator Hayes," he said, his tone apologetic yet professional. "I'm Lieutenant Pierce. I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience this has caused." Camila shook his hand, relieved to find a trace of decency amid this ordeal.
"Lieutenant."
"Thank you, but I'd appreciate it if someone could explain to me why I was detained in the first place." Pierce frowned, pulling a thin report from the folder under his arm. As he flipped through the hastily scrawled notes, his eyes widened in dismay, disbelief settling in as he read Janice's description of the incident. According to Officer Salazar's report, the senator had been acting suspiciously in a deserted section of a mall parking lot. Nothing more, nothing less, just an assumption, based on a look and nothing concrete. Nothing even remotely justifiable. Suspicious. Camila's voice was steady, but her eyes burned with quiet anger. "I was shopping, Lieutenant. Since when is that grounds for an arrest?" Pierce shook his head, an uncomfortable look crossing his face. "No, ma'am, it isn't. This doesn't make sense at all." He glanced at her, then down at the report again, as though hoping for some hidden justification, something that would excuse this glaring overstep. But there was nothing. At that moment, Janice burst into the room, her confident stride faltering slightly when she noticed Pierce and Camila in conversation. Her eyes flicked over Pierce's face, searching for approval, but she found only disappointment. "I have her ID here,"
"Lieutenant."
Janice announced, trying to regain her authority. "Caught her wandering around like she owns the place." Pierce's expression darkened. "Officer Salazar, I hope you realize exactly who you've arrested." Janice's smug look faded into confusion. "Who?" "This is Senator Camila Hayes," Pierce replied, each word laced with growing frustration. "One of the most respected leaders in our state." Janice's face turned pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Finally, she managed to stammer. I didn't know." Pierce's gaze turned cold, each word like ice. You have overstepped your authority on the flimsiest grounds possible." The weight of his words settled heavily on Janice, her bravado crumbling as she realized the enormity of her mistake. For the first time, a flicker of shame crossed her face as she lowered her eyes, unable to meet Camila's steady gaze. Camila stood, her voice calm but unyielding.
"Lieutenant."
"I am willing to move past this, but I deserve an explanation from Officer Salazar." Janice looked up, her voice a whisper, the harsh edge now gone. I thought you were someone else." Camila's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained resolute. "And what exactly did you think, officer?" she asked, her voice piercing through the room like a bell. "That I was suspicious simply because of how I looked?" Janice shifted uncomfortably, the truth hitting harder than any reprimand. She glanced at Pierce, who remained silent, his jaw clenched as he waited for her response. She felt her confidence draining, replaced by an unfamiliar sensation, regret, perhaps, or shame. Pierce finally broke the silence. "Officer Salazar, I'm afraid I have no choice but to suspend you pending an investigation." The color drained from Janice's face, her entire career flashing before her eyes. She opened her mouth to argue, but something in Pierce's expression silenced her. She knew this was her doing, her judgment that had led her here. Camila turned to leave, feeling the weight of the moment and the eyes of the gathered officers just outside the door. With each step, she knew that this wasn't just about her. Not anymore. She had felt the sting of injustice, and she wouldn't rest until change was set in motion, not for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt what she had felt today. As she left the precinct, she could feel the quiet ripples of transformation starting. What had been meant as a moment of humiliation would be a catalyst for justice. And she, Camila Hayes, would see it through. The next morning, Senator Camila Hayes's phone lit up with notifications. messages flooding in from every direction. News of her arrest had made headlines, circulating through social media, catching the attention of journalists, activists, and even her colleagues in the state Senate. State senator detained on suspicion. The headlines read, sparking a firestorm of questions and outrage. Camila sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee as she scanned the news articles, each one recounting the incident with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Her inbox was filled with emails from concerned supporters and friends offering sympathy and encouragement. But among the supportive voices, there were also pointed questions. Reporters pushing for comments on the officer's conduct, on the underlying biases that had led to her detainment. Camila's pulse quickened as she realized the scale of the opportunity laid out before her. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who had endured similar indignities, often without the privilege of a platform to fight back. Her thoughts were interrupted by a call. She recognized the number immediately.
Lieutenant Jordan Pierce.
"Good morning, Lieutenant," she answered, her tone steady. "Senator Hayes," Pierce replied, sounding weary. "I wanted to call personally to apologize again for what happened yesterday. I can't express enough how embarrassed I am by Officer Salazar's actions. I assure you, she's been suspended pending a full investigation." Camila paused, choosing her words carefully.
Lieutenant.
"I appreciate your apology, and I respect that you took swift action. But this incident has exposed a deeper issue, one that goes beyond a single officer's poor judgment. This is about systemic problems within law enforcement, and I believe we both know it's time for change." Pierce sighed, the weight of her words sinking in. "You're right, Senator. I understand if you feel compelled to take this further. My department is ready to cooperate with any investigation you see fit." "Thank you, Lieutenant. I'll be in touch," she replied, ending the call with a sense of finality. The conversation sparked a determination in Camila, a fire she hadn't felt in years. She knew she couldn't let this moment pass quietly. She needed to address the public, to give voice to what had happened and demand accountability not just for herself, but for her community. With her resolve set, she dialed the number of her communications director, her mind already spinning with plans. By early afternoon, a press conference was arranged. The courtyard outside the state building buzzed with reporters and curious onlookers as Camila approached the podium. Dressed in her usual professional attire, her face composed and resolute, the murmurs died down as she raised her hand for silence. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice clear, carrying over the crowd. "As many of you know, yesterday I experienced an incident that was both troubling and deeply revealing. While shopping at a local mall, I was approached, detained, and ultimately arrested by a police officer who, based on nothing more than an assumption, believed I was suspicious." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, faces turning somber as they processed her words. Camila held their gaze, her expression unwavering. While this incident was resolved, it highlighted an issue that goes beyond a single interaction. It's about the assumptions, the biases that too often guide our society, especially within institutions meant to protect us. I am standing here today not as a senator, not even as a victim, but as a voice for every person who has ever been judged, mistreated, or humiliated because of how they look. The crowd's energy shifted, a quiet yet unmistakable intensity settling over them as they listened. A few reporters scribbled furiously, capturing her every word. "This is not just about me," she continued, her voice rising. "This is about every citizen who has been wrongfully profiled, every person who has endured indignity in silence. We cannot, and we will not, let these injustices go unchallenged. I am calling for a full, transparent investigation into our law enforcement's practices and the biases that underpin them. And I am committed to working alongside community leaders, lawmakers, and law enforcement itself to ensure that our policies and training reflect true justice for all." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with meaning. Camila took a deep breath, feeling the power of her words reverberate. She had just made a promise, not only to the public but to herself, a promise that she would turn this moment into a movement, that she would push until real change was achieved. As she stepped back from the podium, flashes from cameras flickered in rapid succession, capturing her strength, her resolve. Reporters immediately began shouting questions, eager to catch her attention. She answered a few before being escorted back inside by her team, a sense of purpose burning within her like a beacon. Inside, her communications director, Anna, waited with an approving nod. "That was incredible, Senator. You couldn't have spoken more powerfully." "Thank you, Anna," Camila replied, allowing herself a small, grateful smile. "But we're just getting started. I want to draft a proposal for police training reforms, mandatory anti-bias programs, and a task force to address racial profiling complaints. And I want it ready by the end of the week." Anna's eyes widened, but she nodded, already scribbling down notes. "Absolutely. I'll pull together the research and get a team on it right away." As the afternoon slipped into evening, Camila worked tirelessly, the events of the day fueling her drive. She called allies, strategized with advisors, and drafted the first lines of a proposal that she knew would take months, even years, to see fully realized. But she was prepared to face the fight head-on. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Janice Salazar sat alone in her apartment, the silence pressing in around her. She hadn't left since her suspension that morning, not wanting to face the judgment of her colleagues or the public. The shame was relentless, an ache that wouldn't ease no matter how hard she tried to convince herself that she had only been doing her job. The face of Senator Hayes haunted her thoughts, her own assumptions playing back in her mind like a broken record. What had she seen that was truly suspicious? Why had she jumped to conclusions so quickly? And how had she let it cost her so much? As the night crept on, Janice found herself searching her soul, confronting her prejudices, questioning the values she'd sworn to uphold. For the first time in her career, she wondered if she'd been wrong, not just in this moment, but in the countless others that had come before. And as the clock ticked on, she realized that her life, her career, would never be the same. Back at her office, Camila took a moment to stand by the window, looking out over the city lights, feeling the weight of the day settle in. She had set something powerful in motion, and there was no turning back. A surge of quiet determination washed over her. This was her city, her community, her cause, and she would do whatever it took to ensure that justice would not only be spoken, but lived, by every person she had sworn to serve. The impact of Camila's public statement rippled through the city like an electric current. News channels aired her words on repeat. Analysts and community leaders weighed in, and social media swelled with posts demanding justice and reform. Across the state, people discussed her story, sharing their own experiences with discrimination and profiling, turning Camila's ordeal into a rallying cry for change. It was as if her arrest had unlocked a floodgate, allowing voices long silenced to rise up and demand accountability. Camila could feel the momentum building, yet she knew that meaningful change required more than speeches. She spent the following days rallying support from colleagues and activists, hosting meetings with community leaders, and drafting policies to present to the state legislature. The proposal became her anchor, a concrete response to an intangible injustice, a blueprint for a system that served everyone, not just the privileged few. Yet, amid the whirlwind of public attention, there was one person whose life was unraveling even faster: Officer Janice Salazar. After the suspension, Janice's name had spread like wildfire, her reputation now the subject of scorn and ridicule. Social media posts circulated, condemning her as a symbol of racial bias and corruption within the police force. Her face appeared in online articles, shared with derision and anger by those who had watched Camila's press conference, and who now saw Janice as the embodiment of the system's flaws. For Janice, the fall from grace was swift, brutal, and unrelenting. Alone in her apartment, Janice sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone as notifications popped up, each one another reminder of the damage done. She felt as though she were trapped in a storm of her own making. Her career, something she'd prided herself on, something she had once believed defined her, was slipping through her fingers. In a rare moment of vulnerability, she dialed her sister, Maria, hoping for a comforting voice, something familiar to pull her out of the darkness she found herself in. Janice. Maria's voice was warm, but there was an edge to it, as if she, too, had heard the stories. Are you all right? The words tumbled out before Janice could stop them. I don't know what to do, Maria. I was just doing my job. And now, it feels like the whole world is against me. Maria was silent for a moment, her hesitation palpable even through the phone. Janice, I saw the video of Senator Hayes' speech. Did you really arrest her just because you thought she looked suspicious? Janice's throat tightened. She wanted to explain, to defend herself, but the words felt hollow even before she said them. I didn't know who she was. She looked out of place. I thought. Maria's sigh was soft but cutting. Out of place? Janice, that's not a reason to arrest someone. You're a cop. You're supposed to be better than that. The line went quiet, and Janice felt the weight of her sister's disappointment settle over her like a shroud. She hadn't just betrayed her duty. She'd betrayed the trust of those closest to her, the very people who had always looked up to her. I messed up, Maria, Janice whispered, her voice cracking. I don't know how to fix it. For the first time in years, Janice felt small, vulnerable, forced to confront the uncomfortable truth she had been avoiding. She had let her own biases cloud her judgment, and now she was paying the price. Meanwhile, at the state capitol, Camila's efforts were gaining traction. Her story had reached lawmakers across the aisle, some of whom had initially been skeptical but were now keen to address the growing public outcry. Meetings were held, plans drafted, and, by week's end, Camila had assembled a coalition of politicians, community leaders, and advocates all united by a common goal: to create a law enforcement system that was transparent, accountable, and free from the biases that had defined Janice's actions. On a sunny Friday morning, Camila entered a packed legislative chamber to present her proposal. As she looked around the room, she saw familiar faces, her colleagues, friends, and supporters who had come to witness the moment. Cameras flashed as she approached the podium, the weight of anticipation heavy in the air. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice steady. We are at a crossroads. My experience last week was not unique, and it was not isolated. It was one instance in a pattern that too many of our citizens have endured in silence. Today, I am introducing a proposal that will require comprehensive training on racial bias, create independent oversight for law enforcement, and establish a dedicated task force to investigate incidents of racial profiling. The audience listened intently as she outlined each part of the plan. Her words met with nods of approval and murmurs of agreement. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, and Camila felt a sense of hope, a spark of possibility that change was finally within reach. But as the applause faded, one figure lingered in the back of the room, observing quietly Janice Salazar. She had come out of curiosity, drawn by the strange compulsion to understand how her actions had spiraled into this pivotal moment. As she watched Camila speak, Janice felt a pang of regret, a dull ache that gnawed at her as she realized the depth of the harm she had caused. She wasn't just an officer who had made a mistake. She had become a symbol of the very thing Camila was fighting to change. The realization was devastating. After the meeting, Janice approached Camila, her steps hesitant, her voice low. Senator Hayes? Camila turned, surprised to see Janice standing there, her face etched with a mixture of shame and determination. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their shared experience hanging between them like an invisible thread. I came here because, Janice faltered, struggling to find the words. Because I wanted to apologize. For everything. I can see now how wrong I was. How blind I've been. Camila looked at her, a mixture of empathy and steely resolve in her eyes. Officer Salazar, I appreciate that you're here, but an apology doesn't erase the damage. Change isn't just about words. It's about action. Are you ready to commit to that? Janice swallowed, her gaze unwavering. I am. I don't know what that means yet, but I want to learn. I want to do better. Camila studied her for a moment, weighing the sincerity in her eyes. Finally, she extended a hand. Then let's make sure this moment means something. Change doesn't happen from the outside. It has to start from within. Janice shook her hand, the gesture small but monumental. Promise of growth and responsibility. In the days that followed, Janice began working with Camila's task force, dedicating herself to reform and accountability. She spoke publicly about her experiences, confronting her biases and taking steps to educate herself and others in the department. She became an unlikely advocate for change, a voice for the very cause that had once led to her downfall. And for Camila, the journey continued. With each passing day, she saw the seeds of transformation taking root, not just in policy, but in the hearts of those willing to confront their own assumptions. Her arrest had become a spark, igniting a movement that stretched beyond her own story, reshaping the community she had vowed to serve. In the quiet of her office one evening, Camila looked out over the city, the lights twinkling like stars against the darkening sky. She felt a profound sense of purpose, knowing that this fight was far from over, yet hopeful that it was moving in the right direction. Months had passed since that fateful encounter in the mall parking lot. In that time, Camila had witnessed the beginnings of true change. Her task force had pushed forward reforms that were once considered improbable, addressing the biases that had long seeped into the practices of law enforcement. Policies were being implemented: mandatory bias training, an independent review board for complaints, and a streamlined process to address cases of discrimination within the department. The journey was just beginning, but the results were already tangible, and Camila's heart swelled with pride as she saw the first fruits of her efforts. Yet, there were moments when the fight felt overwhelming, the hurdles towering and the resistance fierce. Some officers and officials resisted the reforms, their loyalty to the old ways unshaken. And every time Camila stepped forward, there were whispers, subtle pushbacks, but she reminded herself, and her supporters, that change was rarely welcomed by everyone. It required relentless determination, patience, and courage. Today, she was preparing for an event unlike any other. A community forum, held at City Hall, was scheduled to gather law enforcement, activists, and community members, all coming together to discuss progress and challenges. This forum would be different. It was a bridge Camila had worked tirelessly to build, where every voice would be heard, where both sides could face each other, not as adversaries, but as allies united by a shared goal. As she adjusted the microphone, she noticed familiar faces in the crowd. Among them was Lieutenant Pierce, his expression filled with respect and gratitude. Nearby, she spotted her communications director, Anna, giving her a reassuring nod. But her eyes were drawn to one figure sitting quietly at the back, Janice Salazar. Janice had changed since that day in the interrogation room. The brash, self-assured officer was gone, replaced by someone softer, humbler, someone willing to confront the parts of herself she had long ignored. She had joined Camila's task force as a liaison, a role that once would have seemed impossible for her. Her transformation was visible not just in her posture, but in her actions, her words, the way she listened with open ears to the people she once might have dismissed. As Camila took her place at the podium, she felt the weight of the moment settle around her. The room quieted, every eye fixed on her, every ear poised to listen. She took a breath and began. "Thank you all for being here today," she said, her voice strong, yet warm. "This forum is a space for us to come together and confront the reality that bias and injustice have no place in our society. We stand here today as proof that change is not just possible. It's already happening. Applause erupted, brief but spirited. Camila continued, her words weaving through the room with conviction. Months ago, I found myself detained, arrested, for nothing more than looking suspicious in the eyes of one person. But that experience, while painful, has led us here, to this room, where we can speak openly about our mistakes, our fears, and our hopes. It was a lesson in resilience, a call to rise above assumptions, and a reminder that our true power lies in standing together. She paused, letting her words settle, and scanned the audience, her gaze finally landing on Janice, who nodded solemnly, her eyes downcast in quiet reflection. Camila motioned toward her. Today, I want to acknowledge someone who has embraced this change, Camila said, her tone softening. Officer Janice Salazar has stepped forward, not just to take responsibility for her actions, but to become a force for change. She has joined our efforts, lending her voice to our cause, and working to rebuild the trust that was broken. Janice slowly rose, the crowd watching with a mixture of surprise and respect. She cleared her throat, visibly nervous, but her voice was steady as she spoke. I don't expect forgiveness, she began, her voice barely above a whisper but resolute. What I did was wrong, and I will carry that shame with me. But in this journey, I've learned that recognizing my own biases, acknowledging them, is the only way forward. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary, and I'm committed to being a part of it. The crowd murmured in approval, and Camila felt a swell of pride as Janice took her seat, her words lingering in the air like an offering of humility and hope. This was what Camila had envisioned, a world where accountability and redemption could coexist, where people were allowed to grow, to change, to learn from their mistakes. The forum continued, voices from the community sharing their stories, their grievances, their hopes. Camila listened, absorbing each one like a promise to honor, a commitment to see their voices reflected in the changes she fought for. It was raw, real, and at times uncomfortable, but that was how healing happened. She reminded herself, by facing the truth, by standing shoulder to shoulder, even with those who had once been on opposite sides. As the evening wore on, the room began to empty, people filtering out with a sense of renewed purpose, of belonging. Janice approached Camila, her expression tentative but filled with gratitude. Senator Hayes, she said softly, I don't know if I'll ever be able to truly make amends, but I want you to know that I am grateful. Thank you for giving me the chance to change, for showing me a path forward. Camila placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, her gaze warm and understanding. It's not just about me, Janice. It's about what we can do together, about creating a system that works for everyone. I believe people can change when they're willing to face themselves honestly. I believe that you can be part of that change. With a small, grateful nod, Janice left, and Camila felt a quiet peace settle within her. She had always believed in justice, in accountability, but now she understood that true justice included the possibility of redemption. Her journey had taught her that change was both an internal and external battle, a fight to hold onto hope even in the face of prejudice, to demand more from others and, just as importantly, from oneself. That night, as Camila returned to her quiet home, she took a moment to reflect on the months that had passed, on the changes she had seen, the alliances she had formed, and the lives that had been touched. She realized that this journey, though filled with hardships, was only the beginning. She would keep pushing forward, not just for herself, but for everyone who deserved a world built on fairness and respect. And as she gazed out over the city lights, she made a silent promise, a vow to continue fighting, to keep building a bridge between justice and compassion, knowing that, one day, it would lead to the world she dreamed of.